Everybody here. I assume we're ready to go. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the first seminar of the Australian Robotics Centre for 2022. My name is Markus Rittenbruch. I'm an academic at QUT in the School of Design, and I'm going to co-present with my colleague, Associate Professor Donovan, on participatory design and co-design in manufacturing. So what I'm going to do is look at participatory design, some of the core principles, and a little bit of the history, but not too much, given that participatory design has been around for about 50 years. But we want to look at the concepts of participatory design, and then my colleague Jared will give some applied examples. I'll start with the acknowledgement of the traditional owners. QUT acknowledges the tribal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to the elders, laws, custom, and creation spirits. We recognize that the lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. QUT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. Okay, so this is a scene from Fritz Lang's movie Metropolis from 1927. And what we see here is so a very complex mechanical industrial setup that a worker is struggling to operate and maintain. And I've picked this image just to show that questions around how we can shape working conditions and workplaces have existed throughout the 20th century. And so towards the 1950s and 1960s, we had concepts like semi-autonomous work groups come in, sociotechnical systems, really trying to understand and gain a deeper understanding of how human needs and abilities need to be addressed. Then in the 1970s and 1980s, a huge development was the introduction of information technology into workplaces more generally. And that's where participatory design really came in, and participatory design was pioneered in Europe, in particular in Scandinavia in the 70s and 80s, and it was part of the workplace democracy movement, and was in response very much to the widespread introduction of IT into the workplace. So I'll start by looking at one project that happened in the 80s in Scandinavia. It was a project that looked at the way that the introduction of IT changed the work of typographic workers who worked in newspapers and who were doing layout and setting. And at the time, there was software programs came in that automated some of this process. So the Swedish Center for Working Life, the Royal Technical Institute of Sweden, and researcher from Aarhus University in Denmark got together to engage in this project. And their focus was really on looking, rather than using computers just for automation, how can we design better tools that allow people to do their job better? So here's a summary from Pelle Een, who was one of the researchers on the project. Said the focus was focusing on democracy and worker participation, actively searching alternative futures through collaborative design things. At the end, at the time when computers entered the shop floor, threatening to de-skill workers and tight managerial control. So the question is very much how can we use computers to support workers, and then how do we design these computers to do that? And the focus was very much on the quality of the work and the quality of the product. So the notion behind participatory design is it wasn't just about making computers more usable and more humane. It's also understood that if humans became experts in using computers, they could basically achieve better outcomes and better quality. And one of the lasting legacies of the project was, other than the fact that it introduced the notion of participatory design, were the methods and the way that the project sort of explored how to actually engage people in the design process. So looking at technological alternatives, both software and hardware, understanding tested knowledge, hands-on experience, simulation, games, low-tech prototypes and mock-ups. So these were really sort of the first exploration of participatory design methods. So if we're looking at participatory design more general, there are two really important roles that come together. The first one is the role of the people who are experts at their work and who are participating in the process. Those are the stakeholders. And the other role is the role of the designer who comes in and helps to run the design process. So from the process of the participants, the motivation behind participatory design, or PD in short, is that technology isn't just existing in isolation. It actually shapes the way that people work, but it also shapes the way that people live their lives. We spend a large amount of our time in our working lives. So the technology, how the technology is designed, our workplaces are designed, has a direct impact on our lives. There's a shift from seeing people as informants in a process like requirements engineering, where you sort of would just understand what people do and then write up the requirements and then take that to design software, for instance. A shift towards participants, so make them active participants in the design process. So there's a primacy to human action and people's right to participate. And the other important question is how to enable people. So most, say, workers in a factory are not necessarily professional technology designers. So the question is, what methods and tools do we use to help people participate? As a result, the focus of PD is design by doing and practical skills. So it's actually connecting with people where their skills lie. It's not an abstract process, it's a very hands-on process. And again, the focus is on improving both the quality of the product and the quality of the process as well. So actually understanding not just an individual machine, but also the overall operation and how it ties in. So the first role were the participants, and then sort of somewhere in the middle is really the questions of understanding practice and context. So many work environments are very complex, they're highly skilled. So how do we understand what people do? And the notion here is on understanding practice, what people really do. So it's not an abstract notion of having a workflow model or a conceptual model of how a process should work, but it's actually looking at how people really work, sort of going into a factory and studying people, working with people to see whether there are workarounds, whether there's tacit knowledge that's actually not captured, and really understanding that. So it's understanding the context in which the technology will be used and the processes and practices. And the result of that engagement is a rich account of the work rather than abstracted work procedures. The other challenge here is that work doesn't often happen in isolation, but work is collaborative. And that's generally even more complex to capture. So we have collaborative, the notion that collaborative work is socially organized and situated. Researchers like Lucy Satchman and Wanda Olikowski sort of have brought in this notion that people don't just follow given plans, but work is actually socially organized in the sense that it's often negotiated, and their social interaction and emergent situations that require a dynamic sort of interaction between people and how they work. A similar sort of methodological shift took place in software development, where sort of the predominant notion of the waterfall model, where you sort of just understand work, write up requirements, and then build software, has been challenged by the emergence of agile methodologies that actually iterate and understand work processes. So there was a methodological shift. So things like design workshops, bringing people in to co-design and participate, but also research in the wild, actually going into the factory, going into the workplace as researchers, as designers, and working with people to understand what's happening on the ground. And the last perspective is the one of the designer. So participatory design is design. It's a form of design, and it sort of, it relates to Schoen's notion of reflection and action. So the notion that design is based in practical use and understanding. So it's interaction between understanding and creativity. So it's a cyclical process where people are engaged in convergent and divergent thinking. So we're looking at what is currently there, how can we imagine a positive alternative future, and how can that be developed and iterating over that process. And the way that is done is by using design methods, tools, and techniques. And that's where the designer really comes in. So the role of the designer is to be an expert in understanding how to use those methods and tools and to help foster this design process. So often that means developing specific scenarios, mock-ups, prototypes, but it can also mean working with existing technologies. So many technologies these days are off the shelf. We probably wouldn't design a cobot from scratch. Cobots can be bought, but the question is that once a cobot has been implemented, integrated, how do people work with these existing technologies? There are also questions around tailorability. To what extent can end users actually tailor the functionality either to individual requirements or group requirements? The notion of designing after design. So once a technology has been integrated, it doesn't mean that's the end of the design process. It might continue to need further adjustment, etc. And the broader notion of infrastructuring, which looks at the fact that it's not just individual technologies, but also the overall socio-material settings within within which the technology are situated that might need to be designed. All right, so here's a bit of a wall of text, my apologies. But I think these are two definitions of PD. And there's one aspect I want to highlight here. I'll give you a few seconds to maybe look at the definitions. So the first one is from Robertson and Simonsen in their seminal textbook on participatory design. And the second one is from Böttger and colleagues, a recent textbook on PD. And really one of the overarching concepts that's really critical here is the concept of mutual learning. Mutual learning is mutual learning between the stakeholders in the PD process. So predominantly the people who are working or are part of an organization and the designers who are coming in and helping to shape and build technology. And mutual learning between multiple disciplines in collective reflection of action means people are jointly engaging in the design process and jointly learning from each other. And again, in this second definition, finding this notion again and saying that mutual learning starts with the current practices of people in groups and organizations and uses future alternatives for joint reflection and action. So this notion of future alternatives is very important. So we're not just designing for the status quo, we're designing for potential future outcomes and the way that people would like to work. So in summary, here's some of the commitments of participatory design. It's committed to democracy at the workplace and beyond. It's concerned with empowerment of people through the process of design. It aims for emancipatory practices that are rooted in mutual learning. And it is fundamental that humans are seen as skillful and resourceful and are involved in the development of future practices. So I talked a bit about methods and tools, and these are really central to the actual doing of PD and the process of PD. And throughout the last 40 or 50 years, there have been many examples and many methods and tools that have been tested and trialed. Some of the most common ones are design workshops, where designers and stakeholders get together to design specific outcomes. The notion of prototyping, the notion of iterative development, and very much the notion of mock-ups, of building examples of technology at different levels of fidelity. It can be very low level using paper and cardboard, or it can be very high level. I've got a few photos here of design processes and resources that we've used in the past. But what I'll do now is hand over to my colleague Jared, who'll give us some more concrete examples before we come back at the end to wrap up. Thank you, Jared.
Thanks, Markus. Yeah, thanks very much, Markus. So I've been looking forward to giving this talk because, you know, in the center, the discussion keeps coming up about what we're dealing with is more than just the technology of cobotics. We have to think about all of these other issues that are coming into play as well. And what I think is useful about participatory design, the tradition of participatory design, is that it gives us a lot of tools to work with new technologies and ways of bringing them into a process of design and change with a really clear kind of commitment, an ethical commitment to the people that we're designing for. This image is from my PhD project, which is where I first got to know participatory design. And this is an image of a technical prototype that was made by a master's project, a master's student before I started my PhD. So they had made this technical gizmo which could recognize a limited set of predefined gestures. A very rough but working prototype. And my thesis was really about how could we find a home for this technology? It seems interesting, but where would it fit in the world? And what do we have to actually do to design this to make it useful for someone in the world? So if you go to the next slide, where we ended up looking was in dentistry, because dentists at that time were increasingly adopting PC computers into their surgeries, which were very cumbersome to use. So there was a need for more lightweight and, I guess you could say, natural ways of interacting with these computers. So this idea of a gestural tool that could allow the dentist to interact with the information in the surgery in an easy way was attractive. But where participatory design came in, it was all about understanding, well, what does a dentist do in the surgery practice? What's actually important about that work, and how do we design this technology to fit there? So very much about doing those workplace studies that Markus talked about, and then prototyping with the technology. So on the image on the right, you can see an early prototype where we took that gesture ring and repackaged it in a way that it could be manipulated by the dentist in a participatory design session. If we go to the next slide. During my PhD, I also worked on a really fascinating project which was supported by a Danish company called Danfoss, looking at distributed control systems for brewery technicians. And breweries are kind of big industrial processes, and there are these people who are the filtration technicians who walk around the brewery and make sure that process is proceeding smoothly. And there was a sort of an interest in could we move away from centralized control rooms to control these industrial processes to distributed control systems? And if the company was to do that, how would they be used by people, and how would they work with people, fit with people's work again? So we went and followed people in their work, asked them about what was important in their work, and then got their feedback on our observations. So if you go to the next study, a really important sort of principle, I think, in participatory design is that you actually invite people not just to be observed, but to help tell you what those observations mean. So here the filtration technician was actually sitting down and watching that video that we collected and helping us to analyze it. And then if you go to the next slide, also taking early prototypes back to discuss in context what would make sense in that work. So engaging with those processes of workplace studies and prototyping. There's a notion of situated action, which is really important in participatory design, understanding how work takes place in a specific context. And that's one of the reasons that we often do things on site and with people directly, rather than looking at formalized representations of workflows. Go to the next slide. The next few examples I'm going to draw on the postdoc that I did in Denmark in like 10 years ago now. I finished that, but it was at a place called the Participatory Innovation Research Center, which was a center set up to explore whether we could use principles from participatory design and ideas from business like the lead user approach or user-driven innovation, and approaches from anthropology like design anthropology to come up with a way of having a more participatory approach to processes of innovation. So the first project I worked on there is on the next slide, and that was called the USEC project, User-Supported Embedded Configuration. And it was a study of how refrigeration technicians go about the process of configuring these little controllers like the AK2 series when they're commissioning a new refrigeration job. This was supported by the same company as the other one, Danfoss. And if you go to the next slide, what we realized is that a lot of the work that's going on here, or a lot of the what we were finding from the workplace studies, actually we needed to understand also the process of how these systems relied on parameters inside. There were all these hundreds and hundreds of parameters, and it became a really interesting question. Well, what of those parameters should we expose to the user, and how should they be exposed? So on the left, you can see a workshop that we ran with our engineering partners, our technical partners from the technical university, where we put all these parameters on the table and said, which ones should be shown to the user. So trying to make the innards of this device visible and a part of the design process. In the next project, I worked with a company that makes little displays for trains. The company was called Focon. And these displays, if you go to the next slide, sit in a little black strip above the seats in the train carriage. And if you just skip to the next slide, Markus. And above each seat, it says basically whether the seat can be sat in or whether it might be reserved. And we're interested in, this company was interested in what new products could they make, and what did people who use these systems really need. And the interesting thing in this case was that the people who actually use this system are the train conductors and the passengers. But if you go to the next slide, the company actually sits within this larger value network where they work with suppliers that they work with, and then the train manufacturer Bombardier, the regulators, the national train carrier DSB, and then the conductors and the passengers. So I think participatory design also invites us to think about not just the end users as participants, but also a whole range of stakeholders. So in this project, following the field studies and work with the train conductors and passengers, on the next slide, you'll see an image from a forum where we brought people from right across this network together to talk about the kinds of potentials for innovation that existed for them. So this included everyone from the train conductors through to the IT manager for the national train carrier. And the next image is another project on indoor climate and quality of life. This again was with a range of companies. They were Windowmaster, Nelan, Isovere, Velux, and Carlbro, all 5 different companies working in the built environment. And they were interested in this whole area of indoor climate and quality of life, because it has a huge impact on well, the value of their products, but also things like greenhouse emissions. It's amazing actually that the way people use their houses has a huge impact on the amount of energy that's used. Most traditional research that's been done in this area, when we think about the participant, it's really at the level of these mannequins. So they set up sort of simulation environments to study things like the transmission of sneeze particles in an office and things like that. And we took a much more human-centered approach. Go to the next slide. Actually going out and asking people in their homes, in kindergartens and offices, how they're using those environments in their day-to-day life. And then creating some prototypes that probed into that on the next slide, which we called prototypes. So yeah, if you see here, this was a prototype that we actually took back to our industry partners, and it would give them advice on how to use their indoor environment. Now I'm just looking at the time. I've got one more project to talk about, and then we can wrap up. So I'll skip through this last one pretty quickly. So we go to the next one. This is what we've been doing most recently on the Design Robotics project back here in Australia. If you skip to the next one, many of you will have seen parts of this project already, but one thing you might not have seen is some work we did where we worked with people from right across the business, from the shop floor, from design, from creation, from fabrication, to come up with ideas about where they could use new technologies, where opportunities were within their work. So I think this is an example of using a participatory approach to not just introducing new technology that you've already decided on, but actually to get people involved in the initial framing of what we should be doing next. And the next slide shows the very famous linishing video, which I'm sure you've all seen, where we by working so closely with people, we're able to deliver quick wins, is what we called it, where we're really adding value into their work in a very direct way, rather than waiting for at the end of a 5-year project to give them value. So that was about it from me. There were a couple of questions I sort of thought we might discuss, like with an industry 4.0, is there a danger of losing a focus on the people that we design for? How should people control these new technologies that we are introducing? Could you engage participants in your research or in your workplace? And is it worth considering a broader range of stakeholders? Are there other people that you might not have thought of bringing into your projects, or the kinds of things that you're doing? So Markus, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, great, thanks, Jared. I just got get 2 slides to wrap up. The first one is just to share with you the resources that I used, largely relied on. Which are 2 books on participatory design. One is by Tony Robertson and Jasper Simonson from 2013, called the Routledge International Handbook of PD, and the other one is from Susan Böttger and colleagues on participatory design. So they're great resources. And just to wrap up, I think just wanted to highlight the challenges of using PD in complex industrial environments as well, because we're not necessarily just dealing with people using sort of computers or using sort of technological equipment one-on-one. We're actually looking at sort of complex collaborative environments where we have multiple humans and potentially cobots working together. So understanding these complex contexts, understanding the collaborative processes, how we interface with robotic systems is a challenge that's been recognized in participatory design. So people have talked about the fact that if we introduce concepts like AI and machine learning, how do we actually skill up both participants, stakeholders, and designers to understand the scope of design on these technologies? And with regards to our research program on human-robot interaction, that ties in directly into some of our projects. For instance, intention visualization, which is one of our projects where the robot projects its intentions to users, is very much about supporting collaborative work. And the prototyping toolkit is very much about enabling people to actually jointly prototype for human-robot interaction. Okay, I'll leave it there and we'll open for questions. So any questions from the audience? We stunned everybody into silence.
So Glenda and John have said that was good.
I've got a quick question then.
Yeah.
So the examples, of course, you have an expert doing their current job and a designer kind of, working with them. What about when you require multiple experts getting together for the first time and a designer? Is that easy? Does it change the situation? Do you need to be a counsellor as a designer to get these different skills to work together? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, so I think in that USET project where I talked about the parameters, that was a project with lots of experts. There were lots of experts in the company. There were and this is often the way it is. There's experts in the company that's doing the manufacturing. There are experts, research partners. There are the expert end users. There might be, and that's often what those workshops are for. It's to get a forum where you get people together. And really the job of design there is to design those workshops in a way that they are productive and you can actually answer questions and find out what the needs of different people are.
Okay, cool.
I'd just like to add to that because it's really summarising a lot of the thinking that we're trying to get to at Swinburne, at least, as well, around design-led thinking of how do we engage people with different levels of knowledge as well. That being really important because when we're getting a team of people who have different purpose around that table and giving everybody a voice, it's really interesting because that's one of the challenges we have in my space, more in med tech, is that the people who actually know how things work get drowned out by the people who think they know how things work. Yeah,
that's right. There are the experts in the use of these technologies often, and then there are the sort of maybe the academic experts or the regulatory experts who know how it should be done, and those worlds don't always line up. Yeah, Pellian is actually really worth reading on this. He uses Wittgenstein's notion of language games as a way of thinking about what's actually happening when designers and users and other people get together in these workshops and start using prototypes. He talks about that as a process of language gaming, where people are kind of using these tools as ways of creating new practices through this process of language gaming. I think it's a really useful, fruitful kind of theoretical perspective.
There's the other thing of releasing people from their day jobs to actually say, what is the problem? And unpack what is possible rather than going, well, I've only got control over this little tiny bit of it. And so I couldn't do it because that wouldn't work. And so I think that's often the setup that we have in these sessions to allow people to break away from their norm. And I think that probably also comes back to then the acceptance piece of the outcome and the ownership of the outcome, coming back to sort of the stuff that Penny and Greg and people do about, I helped design this so it's actually fit for purpose.
I've got a comment that you might like to respond to rather than a question. I guess there's an implied question. Well done. Music to my ears. It's great that you gave that historically situated account of this important methodology that's used widely in many contexts. And I just wonder if we could evolve a particular species of participatory design that was very useful to our industry partners and to ACC, that could kind of be something that we're all aware of as a tool that we have co-designed as a centre using the same principles of participatory design, and where, when applicable or when necessary or when requested, that methodology would be a good starting point for a whole range of disciplines across the centre. And so I wondered if you had given any thought to co-designing not just gadgets, but also research methods.
Yeah, I think, I mentioned that that Spire Centre that I was involved in, and I think that was actually a great example of bringing together different expertise from business, from anthropology, from design, from engineering, and making a new sort of a methodology. And I think there's definitely the opportunity for us to do that in our centre. And I think one of the other things that's really important to say about participatory design is that it's not a fixed thing. You know, participatory design has changed a lot, and it keeps changing because the world that we're working in is changing all of the time as well. So yeah, I definitely don't think that, I personally don't go into participatory design with a kind of purist religious view of either you're doing it right or you're going to hell or whatever. I think it's really the notion of participation and asking yourself, how could that be useful for what I'm doing right now? That's important.
And I agree. So in terms of it's almost inevitable that then if you're engaging in participatory design, because reflection action is a reflection on not just the prototype, but also on the process, that you have some form of insight that can share in terms of how PD can be done. But I think at the practical level, really looking at the tools is going to be critical, because we're not dealing with, we're not designing a phone app, right? We're designing a complex process where people work with coboards or with related technologies. And so that technical literacy in how to translate the hands-on knowledge of people into an environment where coboards play a role, I think is really not fully understood. And there are huge opportunities for us to make a contribution.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there's very, very, very deep disciplinary training and knowledge in the disciplines and sub-disciplines that we have across the centre, and we could never underestimate the depth of disciplinary knowledge and the amount of time it's taken to acquire it and apply it and learn it, contextualize it in specific settings. And so whilst it sounds simple to actually share that knowledge and work across it, it's not actually that simple at all. And it's a very interesting meta challenge for ACC. I think if we can make even small progress on how we can actually do that, and working with industry partners where a lot of their knowledge is deep, it may be explicit, it may be codified, it may be tacit, it may be expressed verbally, visually, behaviorally. There's a lot of information for us to get really good at working with and putting to practical and research use. And the way that information is shared can be like a breakthrough. I remember in the Arm Hub, the one that stands out for me is just, it's really, really simple, but it illustrates the point. And that was working with Young Guns when Anthony did a spatial mock-up of the actual logistical space that where the innovation was meant to be, with some bodies in that space. And not too many people can do that. It's an industrial design and architecture skill that is it's hard to acquire, and it's easy to deploy once you're really, really expert at it. But there are a lot of examples of mocking things up in the Arm Hub technically, or all those things that adds to the stock of knowledge. So I'll shut up. I could talk about this a lot, but I think there's something in the way that we can work together as ACC where we can, through our combination of deep expertise, do something that's really well leading.
Absolutely. Thanks, Greg. I see Sally's posed a question in the chat. I'll just read it out. It's the exposure to activities that work to draw that information from people connected and unpack fuzzy front-end stuff. It is also how we use AR, VR to complement.
What I'm trying to get to is it's those core activities that help different people from different communities to come together and feel confident to share. Most of this is about trust at the heart of it. And often we go stomping in our big boots, not intentionally, but the immediate sensation of talking to somebody from academia is, oh, well, maybe I can't contribute. And that's what we hear a lot from people we work with, is that they're not clear on what value they're bringing. And so those activities that we have, that even for any meeting we have with industry that helps them to come and us to meet them where they are, is really important. So I'd love to I want that toolbox that comes from the sort of knowledge that you guys have of how to get people comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, so that's you know, very relevant questions, including buy-in from organization, power structure, internal sort of relationships. It's complex.
And language too, I think. This whole upskilling word, which is my pet hate. You know, there's no such thing as upskilling. There's different skills, but one isn't above another. Yeah.
Right skilling.
Yeah.
It's all buzzword bingo.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to run.
Yeah, we all do, actually.
I'm cutting it to the wire. So yeah,
Thanks so much, Markus and
Thank
Jared.
you everyone for
Really
listening.
Thanks everyone for
listening.
attending.
All right, see ya.